last week, we talked about your catch-up. Our spiritual conversation last week was about your catch-up, but it wasn't really about catch-up, was it? So if you experienced that conversation, and if you didn't, you can catch it later on YouTube. But if you thought about that part of the conversation and you got to that part where you either knew the answer, and I'm not going to say what the question is. If you didn't hear last Sundays, you got to go back and find the question. But if you knew the answer or didn't know the answer, you may have had some self-judgment. You may have thought, oh, it's right if I know the answer to that. It's not right if I don't. You may have felt attacked by that thought, or you may have felt justified by that thought, or you may have thought about other people and what other people do with that thought. You may have felt superior. You may have felt inferior. So here's the key. Here's the key. Communication, which is really what we're talking about. This is our series on communication, is about what works for you. It's about what works for you. And I extend that to you and your close family, friendships, community. So communication is about what works for you. There are not right and wrong answers, right? If it works for your life, it works for your family, good, good. A lot of times though with communication, it doesn't work for someone around us and we may not even be aware. And sometimes it doesn't even work for us and we don't know it. We don't realize it's not working for us. And we continue to do the same things over and over. And we actually self-destruct an aspect of our lives or self-destruct peace unknowingly. Because our style of communication either isn't working for our own life or it isn't working for the world around us and those who are in it. Amen? So what can we do about this and how does the spiritual practice apply to this conversation? Because communication is not about right or wrong, it's about what works. So today we're going to focus on Unity's fifth principle and its action. These principles are nothing if we cannot put them into action, into motion in our lives in a practical way. That's principle number 5. Well, go back to principle number 1 and 2. Principle number 1 is there's one power and one presence, God, the good omnipotence. It doesn't matter what we name God. There's one force field. It is good. It is love. It is it. It is the named. It is the unnamed, and it has no opposite. It is what it is. You don't even have to believe it for it to be it, right? And the second principle is that you are it too. You are a full aspect of this emanation of the one power and one presence. You cannot actually be separate from it. It is in you, it is through you, it is as you in this world expressing. So those two principles together bring us to unity. They bring us to a unity of consciousness. So we are taking that unity of consciousness, principles number 1 and 2, and then putting them into action, principle number 5. So if there is one power and one presence, and it is good, and it is intelligence, and it is harmony, and it is love, and that is in each one of us, then it is incumbent upon each one of us to activate principle number 5 and figure out how, explore how, and discover how we can understand the truth in these principles and activate that feeling of unity, of harmony, and of communication, bringing us together in our world. Now, communication at its height isn't two beings talking to each other. Just like we are not separate from God, even though we talk like that and we say these things, your relationship with God, whatever it is, but there is in truth no separation. Well, it's the same thing with communication. In the deepest sense, in the deepest practice, at its height, communication is communion. Communication is communion. So that is the elevated thought that we are reaching toward, or that we are allowing to express through us, allowing to become our experience when we apply spiritual principle to real life where the rubber hits the road. We are looking at going from crunchy, terrible communication or whatever it is, you name it, whatever you're think about some of your worst conversations. Think about some of your worst communication experiences. I mean, you can't think too long before you just feel gross, dirty, icky, resentful, sad, ashamed, right? A whole slew of ungodly thoughts come to mind. Your experience probably of just even being just starts to just, and then think for a moment of your purest communion experiences, communing, where someone just gets you, or where what you expressed was really received, where you felt seen and heard and known to the point of awe and wonder, where you've really felt your connection. It could be your connection with your source. It could be your connection with others. One of the things that I like to teach when we talk about spirituality and spiritual principles and God in unity is that we each have a unique, individualized God language. See, a lot of people either come from an unchurched background, or they come from a spiritual, religious background that stressed a particular God that formed itself in particular ways and communicated in particular ways. And for many of us, that left us feeling like we could not find God, like we could not communicate with God, or that we were communicating, but we weren't getting anything back. We weren't getting a response. I can remember as a little girl sitting in my bed, hovering in the covers and just trying to ask God to show me, like, show me yourself, show me you're there. Ask Jesus, like, if you could I just see your face for a second? Like, please. Because in the tradition I grew up in, we were taught these things. We were taught you will hear, you will hear. So as a kid, I was listening with my ears. I was looking with my eyes. And I was desperate to know, to feel, to experience more, but I was left with a void every time. I was left with the silence. And when I came to Unity, I remember talking to Norma Iris Rosato. She is one of our most incredible Unity ministers. And I remember saying to her, how do you know you're hearing God or experiencing God? And I remember this kind of naive question and posing it to her in the beautiful safety of her insanely open and incredible heart. And she looked at me and she said in her beautiful accent, what other voice is there? Because I would say to her, is this voice that I'm hearing, it sounds like my voice. Is that? And she would just say, what other voice is there? And what that opened for me was the pathway to the practice of non-duality. Just taking that concept, just taking that practice that she so gracefully handed to me, I was able to bring that thought into my spiritual practice and move through the criticism of the mind into the experience of God consciousness and communion. But we don't always know our God language. And when we don't know our God language, we often feel like we're left out. So how am I reading, seeing, sensing, experiencing God? Why is that important? Because it determines often how much love we feel, how grounded we feel, how spiritually centered we feel. And human communications are no different. If there is one power, and that power is also activating in and through and as you, then that is a godly relationship, no? With everyone on this planet. In fact, not even just everyone, the planet itself and all the animal creatures, everything on this planet, every experience, every relationship is really a unity. It's a unification, but experienced from a sense of separation or a lens of other. But our spiritual practice tells us that sense is just a sense of separation. It is not a truth. There's no truth to the separation. So human communications are no different. Yet they can make or break a relationship. They can determine if siblings distance themselves or come together or appear close but are really distanced. They can influence marriage and romance. They can just knock the romance right out of the, well, they could knock it out of the park. That would be better than knocking it into the trash can. But all sorts of things happen because of communication. Right? So you see how this is spiritual? You see how it's about a spiritual practice? You see how it's about the principles? And you see the potential. Keep thinking communion. Am I experiencing communion in my communications? Which communications am I experiencing communion in? And which ones have some space, some room to grow? And how might my life change? How might it expand? How might my experience of heaven on earth be elevated by my diving into these spiritual questions? How might I be a part of bringing heaven to earth if I engage in mastery, the path to mastery in regards to communication? I mean, just think about that for a moment. Really think about that. Think about the level of communication you see in the world and how far it is from communion. Because we are human and we are spiritual. So it affects all of these relationships. It affects the parent-child relationship, right? Who has family systems issues? Just give a little wave. Who has issues with a parent or a child or a grandchild, whatever it is, or a grandparent, right? Oh, it affects everything. And if we're not skilled, if we're not aware, we no doubt experience more discord, disappointment, discontent than necessary. So take a deep breath with me. Are we willing to dive in? Are we willing to do the work that it takes? Are we willing to engage in spiritual learning that will activate a world that not only works for all, but that works better for you, that works better for me? Because there are simple tools and practices that we can all step into to take it to the next level. But many run and hide from communication. They treat it like the blob. It's coming and get me out of here. It's coming and where can I run? Where can I hide? So this was sent to me this week, and I invite you to engage in a social media adventure of figuring out who sent this to me this week. If you know the community pretty well, or you're in the Facebook group at Unity Village Chapel, it's UVC community. If you're in that community group, and if you're not, I encourage you to get in because that's where you get to know people. But you can try to guess who sent this to me this week. It's a very, very serious story. Are you ready? An atheist was coincidentally seated next to the dusty old cowboy aboard a plane and asked him, "Do you want to talk? Flights go quicker if you strike up a conversation with your fellow passenger." The old cowboy, who wanted to read his book, replied to the total stranger, "What would you want to talk about?" The atheist replied, "Oh, I don't know. How about why there is no God, no heaven or hell, or no life after death?" And he smiled. It's a 5-hour flight. I just added that. The old cowboy replied, saying, "Those could be interesting topics. But let me ask you a question first. A horse, a cow, and a deer all eat the same stuff, grass. Yet a deer excretes pellets, while a cow turns out a flat patty, but a horse produces clumps. Why do you suppose this is? That question took the atheist by complete shock. And he said, I have no idea. The cowboy replied, do you really feel qualified to discuss God, heaven, and hell, or life after death when you don't know crap? I need laughter tracks here. We don't know much about a lot of things, do we? We really don't know much about a lot of things. And we sit with a lot of life that's not working for us because we don't take the deep dive into learning. Unity was started as an educational movement. It wasn't started to be a church. It was started to be an experiential, spiritual communion and community based around taking whatever your religion is, whatever your principles are, and really getting that into action in your life, making it come alive. It was about learning. That's why we started with study groups, a whole bunch of leaders and women, mind you, in the beginning when women weren't thought to be able to lead like this, but it started as study groups in people's living rooms and people's houses, and they read books and they explored together. And that's how it began. It only later formalized into a spiritual community that shows itself on Sunday mornings. In fact, most unities weren't Sunday mornings because they wanted to make time for you to go to whatever church you went to, because this isn't church. Has anyone felt like that? That this isn't really church, this is something else? It's a spiritual conversation, isn't it? We gather together to have spiritual conversations every week. And if it's not about something we can take home and do differently, then what is it for? If it's just something that we show up to, put in time, and then we go live our lives and engage in the same things or show up differently to life and to spiritual community, well, that's not what we're about in unity. We're about education, spiritual education. And when we take that journey, incredible things unfold. People transform their lives. People who may have lived 30, 40 years in resentment and anger experience freedom. People who live in pain and suffering experience healing and wholeness. People who felt numb experience the depth of their being and their soul purpose. But most of us, in general, don't invest that much time in learning. You know, we may learn for our professions. We learn in school. We may learn a language. We may invest time in exercising, but we don't invest time in spiritual practice. And in unity, we teach tithing. Part of tithing is tithing of time, talent, and treasure. And that time includes your spiritual practice, includes taking that time for yourself in spiritual study. When we combine learning with spiritual practice, it has a harmonizing effect. It has a transforming effect. And it often even has a life-saving effect. Hear me on that? A life-saving effect. But most of us stay in communication kindergarten or at recess. And for some, it's just a total game of avoidance and they just go on a field trip. Not even in the building anymore. Because we all have trauma around communication. Do you hear that? If we're avoiding it in any way, or if it's uncomfortable in any way. Maybe there are some people that don't have some trauma around communication, but in my experience, most people have some trauma around communication. But when we ignore communication, We fail to say what we need to say. We fail to communicate honestly. We often build resentments or distance or enmeshment. If I mess up, you won't love me. If I don't do it right, I will lose you. If I don't understand you, you'll never talk to me again. If you don't understand me, I'll never talk to you again. If we can't find the place where we have some harmony or some union or some communion, I'm going to write you off. And we've learned this through the hard knocks of life. Yeah? Raise your hand if you've cut someone off or if they cut you off, whether it's a month or a lifetime. Everything can be done in a high and holy way, or at least with emotional intelligence and spiritual intention. But we need to apply some simple tools. So the first tool is this: know thyself, learn about others. Know thyself, learn about others. Do a fearless inventory of what you know about yourself as far as your communications, as far as your style, as far as your triggers, as far as what you need. And be willing to learn about others. Be willing to notice, be willing to observe, be willing to see how they operate. Be willing, when you step into the practice of knowing yourself and others, be willing to pray. To pray for awareness and to expand your awareness. Number 2, get curious. Get really curious. And reserve the word interesting. Get curious about what's happening with you and what's happening with us as far as who you're communicating with. Get curious. And utilize the word interesting. Allow interesting to start replacing the judgments. You hear that? There's going to be some freedom in there. That's the first step of unleashing someone from the terror on the streets of your mind. Start utilizing the word interesting. 3, try new things. Try new things. Start learning and start engaging the spiritual practice as if you are a student of truth. A student of truth says principle 1 is that there is one power and one presence. Principle 2 says I am and you are emanations of that presence. And principle 5 says that's no good to me unless I can put it into action in my life. So I'm diving in. When you dive in, you'll find so many resources. One of my favorite resources is the work by Gary Chapman. He's the author of the book, 5 Languages of Love, the 5 Languages of Love. He also has the 5 Languages of Apology. Did you know you have an apology language? Did you know that you have a way of needing to receive an apology so that you get it? So that it actually arrives in your heart, not just in your ears. And you have a way of giving an apology. When you give an apology, do you want someone to feel it? Do you? For real? Really? Really? If you're sure when you give an apology, you want someone to feel it, I would suggest going to Gary Chapman's website where you can take an online test. If you Google the 5 languages of love or the 5 languages of apology, you'll learn about the forgiveness aspects too. And they have these for children as well. You can take a little test about what your own language is, and you can learn the 5 of each language. And here's the thing, you may be given apologies that nobody can hear. You may be giving apologies that no one can hear, because you're not speaking their language. And so this work can be used in any way, just like any tool. It can be used to crucify and it can be used to emancipate. So you can learn your love languages and then you can stand on your little rock and demand that everyone around you use your language to communicate with you. Or you can learn about yourself. And when you have committed, vulnerable relationships with people who care about and love you and want to learn about you, you can share your language and make a simple request. Would you be willing to have a conversation about how I experience love or apology, and what, as far as I know, what I need to feel heard, loved, forgiven, forgiving, whatever it is, with no attachment to the answer. You could use this work to say, I've learned the languages of love. This is mine. So now I'm going to give it out all according to mine, and you better feel it. Or you could use this work to start really listening and paying attention. Is there a conversation that's come up that you think you apologized? Are you home? It's here again. It's back. That's right. Week after week, month after month, year after year. Who's been married for 50 years? We've got some. Who's been married for 20, 30? Anything that just keeps coming back? Are we going to keep doing the same thing? Or are we going to start listening more deeply, listening with spiritual hearing and seeing with spiritual vision and going, maybe I haven't tried this, the apology language, the language of forgiveness that meets that person's heart. Maybe they're not feeling heard or seen, or maybe I don't know their love language. Are you willing to have a vulnerable conversation? Maybe even invite them to take the little test to see what their love language is. And then begin interpreting life through a different lens. Because this work can be used in so many different ways. If there is someone in your life that their love language just doesn't mean, I feel it to you, or their language of apology just doesn't mean that to you, it doesn't mean you get it. It may even be that just learning about theirs helps you translate it in midair before it lands in your heart. One of the love languages is giving gifts. Some of you might not need gifts. It might not, mean that much to you to get a gift. Just might not be a necessary thing in your life, or it might not mean I love you. But for someone that giving gifts is their love language, when they're doing that, that's their way of saying I love you. Can we catch that midair, recognize that, and say, I'm going to take the good from that. I am going to feel love. Hey, little one in here that needs quality time, or that needs acts of service to feel loved, to get it that I'm loved. Guess what? That's it too. And you get to experience it. You get to say yes to it. You get to feel it. So breathe it in and just know that is them loving you. That is me loving you. That is them loving me. That is us loving each other. There's also a great resource called Nonviolent Communication, and it's otherwise named as Compassionate Communication. And it's simple but transformative. Now, it again is a tool, and a tool can be used to be robotic and to disconnect us, or a tool can be used to unify us and free us. And in nonviolent communication or compassionate communication, you engage in critical conversations. And it looks like this. When you XYZ, you fill in the blank, and you describe with as little charge as possible, like you describe as neutrally as possible. Like if you're a reporter reporting on something that has two very different sides to it, can you give a neutral account of what's going on, a neutral description that both parties are going to be fine with? So when you XYZ, so like if we're saying take out the trash, when you never take out the trash, even though it's yours to do, because I got all this stuff on my plate to do. And I did this and this and that, and you still don't take out the trash. You never, black and white thinking. No one never takes out the trash. Come on. Kindergarten. All you got to do is go, kindergarten. There's my kindergarten voice. Actually, our kindergartners are probably a little better than some of us are as adults. But when you, I feel, and then you express the emotion, and it's that simple. When you blank, I feel blank. And then you make a request. Would you be willing to? And then you fill in the blank. The key is you got to be willing to take no for an answer and understand that that just means I got to change how I show up, or I tried. And here are some other tips. So let's give another example. When you misplace the ketchup, I feel angry. Or when you leave out the ketchup, I have a sense of impending doom and anxiety. Even words like misplace can be a trigger. We learn ourselves and we learn each other. But one of the keys to using NVC, nonviolent communication, is to make sure what we're expressing are, again, first, the reporter I, and second, actual emotions. So when you XYZ, I feel, and then if it's not a real feeling, it doesn't work. And I would say the tendency is to go towards things that are not feelings. But when we go to the feelings, it makes us vulnerable, and it invites us to be accountable for how we feel. When you are late, I feel, is there an emotion there? Is there a feeling? Right? So fill it in, make sure they're feelings. Avoid making someone wrong, avoid judgments. Get to the request without attachment, and remember, no is an acceptable answer. If you hear the word I'll try, you might feel a little fire come up. I'll try. You might just re-engage with the pattern and the system of the questioning. Would you be willing to increase that to a commitment? Would you be willing to increase that to a commitment? I used to feel like I had to press through in conversations when there was not harmony. So if there was conflict, I felt like I had to keep going with something until it was resolved. Almost like a compulsion. It's like I wasn't okay if there was something left undone, unsaid, unresolved. I felt it, it festered, it was in my mind, it grew. It didn't decrease, it grew. And what does it grow into? A volcano. It generally grows in, at least for me, grows into volcanoes. And I felt like if someone, especially close, because of course these are generally our closest communications and our closest relationship, if we couldn't get to resolution and understanding, hearing each other and understanding, which may also have been if we couldn't get to the point where they understood where I was coming from and what I felt and validated that my feeling was really right. And showed me they really got it, and that they had a commitment to making sure that it wasn't going to happen again. Not just I'm sorry. I have been known for saying sorry doesn't mean anything. Because in my language of apology, sorry doesn't mean anything. What means something in my language of apology is I understand how that hurt you and that was not my intention, and I'm going to work on that. Or I have an intention not to keep doing this again. I can even remember saying that. Sorry doesn't mean anything if you keep doing it over and over and over again. It doesn't mean anything. You're not allowed to use that word anymore. You can't use sorry. Sorry is now banned. Put it in a garage and do not let it back in the house unless it means something. But I felt like I had to press through until I really lifted communication up to my spiritual practice and sat with the discomfort, sat with what is it in me? What does it feel like for me when something with someone else is unresolved? When I am misunderstood, when I feel misunderstood, not necessarily am, when I feel misunderstood, when I don't feel heard, when something is unsettled, when there is discord, what is it in me spiritually that's going on? Emotionally, psychologically, what kind of enmeshment that I have to have this relationship be okay in this moment before I go to bed or before whatever it is, so that I can allow my shoulders to come back down and feel whole and feel okay, or be treated properly or be treating someone else properly with compassion, kindness, love, sensitivity, grace. One of my dear girlfriends has a daughter who was in her classroom, and the teacher brought out a tube of toothpaste. And she had the kids in the classroom take the tube of toothpaste, open it up, and squirt every last bit of it out onto the table. All gone. Squirted it all out. And then she gave them this exercise. She said, now come around here and put the toothpaste back in the tube. Go ahead, get it in. And the kids all gathered around and tried to squish it back into the tube, scoot it back into the tube, push it back into the tube. And of course, they couldn't get it into the tube. And it's the same thing with all our volcanoes. It's the same thing with our communication. It's the same thing with our relationships. Once it's out, we can't get it back in the tube. We can make amends, we can be vulnerable, and we can grow. We can have more awareness, we can communicate our awareness. But we can't get the toothpaste back in the tube. So what I learned from applying a spiritual practice to communication and conflict and my own life is that spaciousness can lead to heightened awareness, expanded perspective, and proper proportion. By spaciousness, I don't mean avoidance, and I don't mean a delayed surprise attack. You hear me? Like, I don't mean we're not going to talk about it, and then whenever I want to, I'm going to slither in like a snake and bite. And you're going to be like, what? That happened like this long ago and you never said anything. You've been carrying it around? What? And it's not avoidance. By spaciousness, I mean inviting in space for your spiritual practice. And I have found that that leads to heightened awareness, expanded perspective, and a sense of proportion. Because a lot of times when things are up, they're big and they're bigger. So we avoid volcanoes by even just saying a simple thing like, clearly it would serve us to have a conversation about this at some point, and I'll make sure to bring that up, right? Or clearly a conversation would be in order. Can you let me know when you're ready to have that? Or even as simple as, let's get back to this. And then have the commitment to return to it. What I have learned is that prayer can lead to compassion. That when it comes to communication, when it comes to conflict, prayer can lead to compassion. It can lead to awareness. It can lead to transformation. And I've learned that awareness leads to emancipation. Emancipation from patterns, attachment, managing, enmeshment, discord. Stephen Folder wrote the book, Waking Up to the Precious Life, Waking Up to This Precious Life, What's Beyond Mindfulness? And he said this, the fundamental way to expand our compassion boundaries is to be less full of me and mine and more connected to what is really happening and not what I need or expect to happen or want not to happen. Through meditation and spiritual, psychological practice, we can dissolve the intensity of selfing, of habits, of ownership, of pleasant and unpleasant experiences. We may experience the pain in the body and the thought or the emotional life, but we don't do anything with it. We don't fight it or run away from it. We don't get busy with it. We don't try to analyze it. We don't automatically seize it. We just allow it to be fully seen as a painful experience that comes and goes. It's a phenomena that doesn't belong to me or turn me into a victim. We become less identified with it, more transparent, as the pain of ourselves and others touches us and passes on without making tracks. Touches us and passes on without making tracks. Namaste.